It has been 50 years since President Nixon resigned the presidency following the Watergate scandal. But recent documents and information uncovered over the past few years by today's guest is challenging everything we thought we knew about Watergate. We are joined today by Geoff Shepard, who many consider to be the world's leading voice on the Watergate scandal. He is the author of The Nixon Conspiracy and the filmmaker of the newly released documentary Watergate, Secrets, and Betrayals, both of which will be linked in the description below. Geoff served for 5 years on the Nixon White House staff and served as deputy counsel on Nixon's Watergate defense team. He is the man who transcribed the infamous smoking gun tape that forced Nixon to resign, and in fact, he is the one who named it the smoking gun. Also, if you were at all a fan of Elvis Presley, there's a special treat for you at the end. Some behind the scenes, never before heard testimony of the King's visit to the White House in 1970. Enjoy the episode. So, before we get into your area of expertise, this whole entire Watergate scandal, I'd like to talk about your role in the Nixon administration. You worked in the Nixon White House, part of his staff. What was your role in the Nixon administration?
Well, I was awarded a White House fellowship in 1969, 2 weeks after graduating from Harvard Law School. So the program started in September. It was a year's paid study of the executive branch, and I was single and enthusiastic and had no other responsibilities and had an absolute ball. I was assigned the Department of Treasury, but the program, it's usually 15, 16 people each year that come to Washington on this program. You get to meet with almost everybody that counts in Washington over the course of the year. And I threw myself into it. I went to all these meetings and learned tremendous amount. And then by fluke, I was hired onto the newly created Domestic Council at the White House. The Domestic Council is the counterpart of the National Security Council, and it staffs the president on public policy issues of importance to the president. Mm-hmm. And it had just been created, and it was going to be run by John Ehrlichman, formerly the president's counsel. And he took a liking to me and gave me an offer at the end of my fellowship. So I went from the fellowship to the Domestic Council, and I stayed for 5 years. And I rose to a position called Associate Director, and there were 4 principal associate directors, and mine was called General Government. So if you are a little cynical about the executive branch, there's 4 areas they don't farm out: state, justice, treasury, and defense. Mm-hmm. All the other departments are really grant-making agencies, or they help the states with issues, housing or education or that sort of thing. But the core government functions, state, justice, treasury, and defense, that was my purview. And it's the non-foreign affairs part of state. They had trouble issuing passports. That came across my desk. The non-economic part of Treasury. Treasury has a lot of law enforcement and currency issues. That was all under my purview. State, justice, treasury, defense. I wasn't part on the war side, but in my era, the kids were breaking into the armories and stealing guns, and that came to me. And then all the Department of Justice. So, and it wasn't. Wow. It wasn't that I was in charge. I was responsible for being sure what was being done was consistent with the president's desires. And that usually involved submitting issues in writing for presidential decisions. Now, on the foreign affairs side, that was standard. Nixon wanted a National Security Council that functioned like Eisenhower's, which was based on a military model. Mm-hmm. And they had 2 kinds of writings, National Security Study Memorandum and National Security Decision Memorandum. the study memorandum would be, they're they're running out of gas in Indonesia, and we better figure out what we're going to do. Let's look into the problem, and they would analyze it. It was always in writing. The decision memorandums were slightly different. The president wanted to know what's the issue, why do I have to decide, what are my options, and what do people I respect suggest I do? And you had to be able to write that memo so it was perfectly objective. You couldn't load the memo, you'd get fired. Well, what we did under John Ehrlichman on the domestic side was recreate the same issues. Nixon wanted stuff to come in on paper. He didn't make decisions in the course of a meeting in the cabinet room or the Roosevelt room. He wanted to see it on paper, and then there was no doubt what the decision was. Well, I became really good at writing those decision papers. And I could write decision papers about topics I didn't even know about because I knew what he wanted. And he wanted it on a page or two with a bunch of attachments. So he could see what it was, see why it was important. And he frankly didn't care to know what I thought, but he wanted me to objectively present what his advisors thought. It turned out, and this is, I think, interesting. Remember, I went to Whittier College.
Yeah.
Nixon went to Whittier College 30
Right.
years before.
And you both grew up in California.
Well, we both grew up in California. We were both natives. Years after I left the White House staff, I discovered that he and I had had the same English professor at Whittier, but 30 years apart. When the president went, it was this young, aggressive professor. And when I went, it was this crotchety old man. But he taught a course called Basic Communications. And the book that he used was called Design for Thinking. And if I turn away from the camera for just a second, happen to have the book right here, Design for Thinking. And what he taught was an analytical approach to communication. And the interesting thing about the English language and the inherent ambiguity of words, and how a particular word can shade its meaning depending on how it's used in the sentence. So we were taught better analysis and better communication. Well, I think President Nixon saw in my submissions what he'd been taught to appreciate 30 years before. But in any event, I got really good, and I put in hundreds. I was there 5 years. Hundreds of policy analysis papers. Some were, here's a piece of legislation, here's what you got to worry about, or here's the issue we're doing on pretrial release at the Department of Justice. And I got really good at it. So that was one of the things I did on the domestic council. We'll get into Watergate just a little bit later, because I was also toward the end deputy counsel on this Watergate defense team. But after we left, I've done three things. One, remember, his administration blew apart. There was an unexpected resignation, and the staff was cast out to the four winds, particularly after Jerry Ford lost in 1976. Well, this was before email, before cell phones, before the internet, and you didn't know where anybody ended up. But my secretary had one of these brand new IBM machines that was called a mag card typewriter with a kind of a two-drawer file cabinet next to it with all these paper index cards. And that's where the phrase "do not bend, fold, spittle, or mutilate," because it could reprint a page with a two-word change just right away. And we started keeping the directory of where the people were going who had been doing policy planning, NSC, domestic counsel, OMB, on the president's staff. And to this day, 50 years later, I still keep a directory. It's now done by the Nixon Foundation,
Hmm.
directory of where the people are who were in his administration. We got to missing our friends. I used to say that the group, the directory, was mainly the people who didn't go to jail. It was a small group after Watergate. But we started getting together once a year as a reunion for a luncheon. So, starting about 4 years after Nixon left office, I started arranging and hosting annual reunion luncheons. And we would always hold them after the November election because these weren't the campaigning people, these were the governing people. And your viewers may not appreciate the difference, but there's people who are really good at campaigns.
Yeah.
But that's working on issues and exploiting the base and getting people all
Hmm.
riled up to come out and vote. And then there's people who are better at governing.
Hmm.
And if you're going to govern, you got to compromise
Hmm.
and you settle these red meat issues. And sometimes people that are really good at one of them aren't really good at the other.
Hmm.
And I only concentrated on the governing side because I'd been in law school during the 68 campaign. So I had nothing ever to do with the campaigns. The domestic counsel staff was hatched. They couldn't be involved in campaigns. So I'm pretty good at governing and knowing and keeping in touch with people who also govern. Well, we're the only administration that holds regularly scheduled annual reunions. Uh, Starting in 2010, we started producing programs for the National Archives that analyzed various public policy initiatives of the Nixon administration. And we would put on a program at the National Archives or on some college campus of people who worked on a particular issue: welfare reform,
Hmm.
desegregating the southern schools, the opening to China. And since 2010, I have arranged and helped to produce 40 Nixon legacy forums. And if your viewers go on the Nixon Foundation website or the National Archives website or my website and look up Nixon Legacy Forums, they'll find all these programs. And again, we're the only administration to be producing these discussions by the people who worked on the issue. I mean, we're getting scarce
Hmm.
as people start to pass away,
Yeah.
but the archives loves us because what they say, we make their documents come alive.
Huh.
You know, you'll be up there and you'll be talking about welfare reform. Well, why did you do it? What difference did this particular memo make? What happened after the memo was circulated? And we've got the people on record who did the work. Now, again, the, over time, they're starting to these individuals are starting to fade. But those are the two most important contributions I made from a governance point of view:
Hmm.
holding together, keeping the Nixon people in touch with each other, producing these legacy forums, and my seminal work on Watergate.
Yeah, that's so cool. It's so fascinating that Nixon kind of picked up what he learned and what you also learned in your memos. I mean, I know he kind of took a liking towards you. He wrote you a letter, a personal letter after your work on his defense counsel. But aside from the work that you did in the White House and this little Watergate inconvenience, I mean, what is it like to be rubbing shoulders with some of the most enigmatic and infamous characters in American history? You're meeting with Nixon. You're rubbing shoulders with someone who I think is fascinating in Kissinger. What's that like?
Well, it's ego building. If you aren't careful, it can really go to your head, and
Really?
particularly if you're working on the White House staff.
How do you mean?
Now we had the benefit of Bob Haldeman as chief of staff. And Bob was about the toughest guy you'd ever want to wander into. Nixon had trouble firing people and giving harsh instruction. Bob
Mm-hmm.
relished it. I was terrified of Bob the whole time we were on the staff. And my only thought was, I don't want to come to the attention of this man. Uh,
Fly under the
uh,
radar.
Now, I had a great relationship with John Ehrlichman. They had been classmates at UCLA, and that's what made the system work. Was John produced creative ideas on domestic issues, and I was part of that. And it was fun to come to work because you were encouraged to think outside the box. How can we do this better?
Mm-hmm.
Kissinger's staff on the NSC, they worked round the clock. They prepared Henry, but Henry was the only guy that met with the president.
Mm-hmm.
Ehrlichman allowed us to sign our own memos. I mean, that's big stuff, but that's very lawyer-like. Lawyers, in John's view, work with each other, not for each other. And it was kind of the same thing with the Office of Management and Budget. Well, just to give you a couple of examples, and I remember I'm 24 years old when
Yeah,
I
that's
joined the staff.
extraordinary.
I was not involved in the campaign. I did not come from a political family. We lived in Orange County. We were Republicans,
Yeah.
but I never pamphleted or rang doorbells or anything like that. The guy who was the head at the Department of Justice of the Office of Legal Counsel, that's the constitutional division at DOJ, was Bill Rehnquist. And I'm working on creative ideas for legislation and law and order issues. I could go over and talk with Bill anytime I wanted, and he was such a neat guy because he'd say, "Well, now, Geoff, you can't do it that way. I understand you'd like to, but you could almost get there if you were willing to do it this way." And those are fun conversations.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he goes on the Supreme Court. Well, his place, once removed, was taken by Nino Scalia. So I'd go over and see Nino, and same thing,
Wow.
And those are
Yeah.
pretty impressive guys.
Uh-huh.
And then the man who was Deputy Attorney General during Watergate, particularly the end of Watergate, was a guy named Larry Silberman. Larry went on the D.C. circuit. He passed away recently, but he was probably the most preeminent conservative on the D.C. circuit. And he was Deputy Attorney General during the ending of Watergate. Now, your viewers may not appreciate this, but the White House and the Department of Justice have to talk. They cannot agree on some point of view, or they can, be fighting indirectly in court, but they got to be in touch with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And Larry Silberman, as Deputy Attorney General, and I spoke almost every day. What's going on here? How do we turn this heat down on this or that? Or why do you have to go out and do this on Friday? Why can't you wait until Saturday? All the time. And we tease each other that the two of us held the place together toward the end of Watergate, because it was, the government was coming to a stop. It was heady times. And then, cabinet secretaries, really prominent government people, not on the Hill. I didn't work the Hill, in the executive branch. And I didn't meet with judges. You don't do it that way.
Yeah.
But I sure met with a lot of people who became judges.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of Nixon's cabinet originally came to Washington through the Office of Management and Budget. Frank Zarb and Jim Schlesinger and Jim Lynn, all very prominent secretaries of various departments, but I knew and worked with them when they were at OMB. So let me tell you, it was heady stuff.
Yeah, that is so. I can't imagine. I'm 22. I can't imagine as a 24-year-old walking through the halls of the White House, rubbing shoulders. That must have been such a cool experience. And you're right. I mean, that could easily get to your head. So I'm sure you had to constantly remind yourself to be humble.
Well, I drove to work. There's a park between the south lawn of the White House and the Washington Monument called the Ellipse. And if you had a certain sticker on your car, you could park on the Ellipse. And they had a National Park Service guy showing you where to park as you went around the circle. And I would get there just before 7 o'clock every morning, and I would be far closer to the Washington Monument than to the White House. And then I'd walk from my car to the southwest gate and go in between the West Wing and the old EOB.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be crossing at a distance the South Lawn and the balcony that faces south. And I would say almost every morning, you're going to work at the capital of the most powerful nation the world has ever known.
Wow.
You better be sure you do a professional job. It was heady stuff, but you didn't go to cocktail parties. You didn't party. You didn't brag.
Mm-hmm.
If they thought you were doing that, if they thought you were pushing yourself to the front of the line, Bob Haldeman would have your pass extracted within 2 seconds. I got lost on there for a second. I told you I was terrified of the man. Remember, I'm 6'6", so I find it hard to hide in groups. He actually turned out to be probably the ideal chief of staff. He had absolute control over who the president saw and what the president read, but he had no personal philosophy of his own. It wasn't, and by the way, he thought basketball players ought to be recruited to work at the Department of Energy. Bob's only thought was being sure the president was properly staffed and had enough information to make the decisions he was required to make, and saw a variety of opinions from people he respected. And that's hard.
Mm-hmm.
That's very, very hard. But that's what Bob did. Now he got caught up in Watergate. John Ehrlichman got caught up in Watergate. Mm-hmm. I happen to think unfairly. I think they were on the very peripheral of issues, but they were the senior guys. Yeah. And I'm reminded of a conversation. Do you remember Webb Hubbell? Webb was from the law firm, the Rose Law Firm in Little Rock, when Clinton was president. And Webb was going to be Associate Attorney General, the number 3 position in the Department of Justice. And he's up for confirmation. And one of the senators says, I understand you're the president's best friend. And Hubbell says, well, some people say that, And the guy says, well, I think it's only fair to point out that in my experience here in the nation's capital, the president's best friend usually ends up going to jail. And he's right. There was Burt Lance under Carter, and Webb Hubbell ended up going to jail under Clinton. It's the forces that be in the nation's capital. There's this note in the bottom of the briefcase that was owned by Vince Foster. He's the one that killed himself on the GW Parkway. He was in the Clinton White House, and he was handling Bill and Hillary's personal affairs before they got there. And he took his own life. And they found in his briefcase down on the bottom a note ripped in quarters. And it said, this is a town where they ruin people just for sport. And that's true. There's a minuet. Everything seems just wonderful. And you make a misstep and suddenly you're testifying in front of a grand jury. And people rapidly rise and rapidly fail. And you get this distinction. We have new words that have become popular: deep state and false news and fake narrative, and most of all, lawfare.
Yep.
The misuse of the criminal law to attack your political opponents. Well, that stuff all existed back with Nixon, too. And the deep state was a tough nut to crack. When Nixon was elected, 1968, he comes to Washington, January 20th, 1969, he gets sworn in. He was opposed by every institution in the nation's capital, both houses of Congress, virtually all of their staffs, all of the people who had worked on the staffs since 1932, the deep state, which was the protected civil servants, the law firms, the media, the lobby firms. Nixon was a classic outsider, and it's hard for people to remember back, particularly if they weren't alive then. But Californians were considered oddities and strangers. Nixon was an outsider. It's not like today where there's the other coast that is a major player. Nixon was picked by Eisenhower to balance the ticket from way, way, way out west. And he wasn't charismatic. He wasn't well-liked. He had bumped off Alger Hiss as a congressman back in 1946, 47, and the Eastern liberal establishment never forgave him. They hated him. In his first run for office, 1946, against Jerry Voorhees. Voorhees was a 5-term Democrat, and he'd been voted the most popular congressman by the Washington, D.C. media. And here this Quaker from nowhere, serious guy, bumps him off. Wow. And then he goes after Alger Hiss and sinks Alger Hiss. Then he runs for Senate against Helen Gahagan Douglas. And she's a Hollywood starlet. She calls him Tricky Dicky, and he calls her, so she's pink down to her underwear. And he beat her by 16 points. Wow. Well, they just couldn't believe it. And then he gets to be vice president under Eisenhower. Well, remember, Eisenhower's a war hero.
Yep.
He could have run in either party. The political dirty work is done by his vice president, Richard Nixon. So you could have concluded, if you were a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, that the problem after 1972 was Dick Nixon himself. Yeah. That before that, you'd controlled the House since 1932, the Senate since 1932, and the White House except for this guy Nixon. So it was really personal. Every bit as personal it is today. Yeah. There's great hatred for Trump. There was the same great hatred for Nixon, but you added in the Vietnam War, the most unpopular war in our nation's history. Now, there's a group of men, because only men were subject to the draft. It's about 10 years where every decision you made, life decision, keyed off the impact of your draft board. Now, I know that because I was in that group. Register for the draft. They're going to get around to you. And there was the patriots who said yes, and you got to go. And the people who said, no, Mr. Custer, I don't want to go. And it was well understood amongst most men that if you got drafted, you're 18, you got to register, you're subject to the draft. If you got drafted, you were going to Vietnam. When Nixon took the presidency, there were 537,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. And if you went to Vietnam, you were going to die because we lost 50,000 Americans over there in that godforsaken place. So the resistance to the government, the draft dodgers and the people who went to Canada, 2 of my roommates from Whittier College, one went to Canada and never came back, taught at the University of Saskatchewan, and the other became a conscientious objector. Now, that worked pretty well coming out of Whittier. It was a Quaker school. So you could make the case, while I was there, I kind of became enamored of the Quakers' views toward peace. So I don't want to go to war. Well, on the other side, there were people who were going. They didn't necessarily go to Vietnam, but they were enrolling. Whittier didn't allow ROTC on campus. It was a Quaker school. So I get to law school in 1966 from very pleasant, unruffled Southern California to Harvard Square, where there's this professor, Timothy Leary, famous for tune in, turn on, and drop out. It was LSD and drugs and fast protest against the Vietnam War. Well, I didn't want to get drafted out of law school. So I joined Harvard's Army ROTC unit. And then toward the end, the faculty voted it off campus. But you either joined up for something, Navy ROTC, Army, Reserves, National Guard, or you were going to be drafted. I'll finish with this in just a second. If you didn't go to college, you got an automatic deferment for college if you finished in 4 years. Mm-hmm. But if you didn't go to college, you were subject to the draft unless you got married. And then for a while, if you were married, they didn't take you, but they ran out of people. So the bar got raised and you had to have had a kid. Well, if you're in college and you take a semester off, you're not making satisfactory progress toward your degree. So you're subject to the draft. If you get a D in any course, you're not making satisfactory progress. And there were draft boards. I don't know that they were by county, but they were all across the nation. And each draft board had a quota. You're supposed to produce this many warm bodies each month. And by the way, enlistments count against your quota. So you had draft boards in the South where they do enroll in the military, where they were never going to be drafted. And you had draft boards in New England where they weren't about to enlist, and you were really monthly subject to the draft. So there were different standards depending on where you lived. And then we learned afterwards, years later, it was political. There was a guy named General Lewis Hershey who was head of the Selective Service. If you had influence with your congressman, if Daddy was given money for a campaign, he could ask the congressman to ask Hershey to exempt you, and you wouldn't be drafted. Now, we didn't know that, but I got to tell you, if that were known, there'd be riots in the streets. Yeah. Imagine, oh yeah, Bob there has a rich daddy. He bought his way out. So in any event, all of that came down on Nixon's shoulders and contributed to the upset and the dislike. It was a heady time.
Man, I can't imagine how much pressure he probably had on his shoulders. But I think you made a great point a little bit ago that even going into his presidential run in '68, Nixon had been long time hated by what you call the Eastern liberal establishment. He was always seen as an outsider, similar to how Trump today is seen as an outsider. There's so many parallels between those two figures, and we'll get into that later. But let's get into your area of expertise now, Watergate, which is probably the most infamous political scandal in American history. Every subsequent scandal hereafter has the gate suffix added to it. Even in like my circles at work or in friend groups, whenever there's a little scandal or drama, there's always something gate. You know what I mean? It's so infamous. But can you sort of, in broad terms, what exactly was Watergate? What's the timeline we're looking at here?
Well, most people know the word, and virtually no one knows the issue. Mm-hmm. The common wisdom is there was a break-in by the Nixon campaign to gather intelligence illegally on the Democratic National Committee, which had offices in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and they got caught red-handed. And there were 5 of them. And then it turned out there were 2 supervisors or masterminds who had planned it, and they came to trial, and they were convicted. But the issue was who else knew. No one believed that this was done by some renegade campaign official on his own. And it turned out they were right. There were very senior people in the Nixon White House or on the committee staff higher up, the re-election committee staff, who knew or might have known. And there ensued a cover-up trying to cut off the criminal knowledge at these 7 people. The cover-up was run by the president's own lawyer, a guy named John Dean, and it failed, and it should have failed. But one of the problems was that John Dean had an undisclosed personal conflict of interest. He had recruited the guy who developed the campaign intelligence plan and imposed him on the re-election committee, and had been at meetings where that plan was discussed. So when the burglars were caught, John Dean feared his own risk of being prosecuted. So when he was running the cover-up, he was trying to protect himself rather than others. Now, at the moment of the burglar's arrest, it's very clear that neither Nixon nor Haldeman as chief of staff nor Ehrlichman as head of domestic affairs had any inkling about this intelligence plan or that there was going to be a break-in. Mm-hmm. But, and John Dean told them that right away. He looked into it. Nobody here's at risk. But by the time John was through with his inept cover-up, he had infected people in the White House. Now, from the opening, the re-election committee people were at real risk. But the White House itself was clean. But because of the cover-up, people at the White House were now at risk. Mm-hmm. And when it collapsed, John Dean switched sides and said, well, yes, I was involved, but you don't want me, you want my superiors, and I'm the only one that can testify against them. So give me immunity, and I will deliver up really senior people. The prosecutors didn't buy it. I've got all the records. They said, no, you're too involved and you're covering up your own activities. So they declined. But we had just created, the Democrats had created the Senate Irvin Committee that was going to look into Watergate. And John Dean's very well-connected Democrat lawyer, his criminal defense lawyer, approached the Irvin Committee and offered John Dean as a witness who would testify against Nixon's top people. They gave John Dean immunity. And therefore, they had every reason to portray him as a whistleblowing hero rather than the mastermind. The FBI's phrase was master manipulator of the cover-up itself. Now, there's an oral history taken from the lead FBI investigator throughout Watergate. And he was asked, what about the cover-up? He said, I credit John Dean's actions with 95% of the cover-up. But John Dean is seen as a hero because the Irvin Committee hearings were broadcast and the media were grabbing at anything to dump on Nixon and his top people. And so even today, John Dean appears on CNN and is accorded. They don't mention he was disbarred, that he was disbarred for encouraging others to lie to the grand jury. That's called subornation of perjury. For destroying evidence that was taken from one of the safes in the White House office complex. For embezzling money. He took $4,000 of campaign funds for his honeymoon. And for authorizing the payment of money to Watergate defendants. So he's been disbarred since 1974, but they don't say that when they introduce him as a commentator. And what he does, and he's done it for 50 years, whatever the alleged GOP scandal of the day is, John says, it's worse than Watergate. I'll tell you that. I'll tell you that for sure. And I know because I was involved in Watergate. And what is so strange, to finish off the Dean's story, they got worried that Dean's credibility as the witness wouldn't sway the jury when they were prosecuting the cover-up trial. Now, when Dean met with the president, that's on tape. So he's restrained from what he can say. But there are no memos, there's no record of his meetings with Bob Haldeman or John Ehrlichman. It's his word against theirs. Yeah. And what the prosecutors feared was John Dean, his testimony wouldn't be credible. So they got Sirica, the judge who presided, self-appointed judge, preside over the trial, to sentence John Dean to a prison term of 1 to 4 years in advance of his testimony at the trial, with incarceration to begin on the opening day of trial. And he's their lead witness, and he can testify there was a cover-up. I know there was a cover-up because I was running it. I'm being punished. I'm testifying from prison, and these guys were in on it too. You need to deal with them. They were convicted, Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and John Mitchell, his attorney general, convicted on all counts after a 3-month trial. This we're in the timing right now of that 3-month trial. And then 1 week after the trial was over, Judge Sirica reduced John Dean's sentence to time served, which was less than 4 months, and set him scot-free. And then we come to find out again afterwards that John never spent a single night in jail. He was assigned to a witness protection program kept at a nearby Army base for Holabird, Maryland. And he had an office, and he had conjugal visits from his wife. So the guy who planned the break-in and executed the break-in, Gordon Liddy, he did 6 years in jail, and he should have. John Dean, who recruited Liddy, ran the cover-up. He spent no time in jail whatsoever. And the American public is not told those things. But today, because of the way they're going after Trump and these new words, particularly lawfare, the public is open to consideration that maybe things weren't all done correctly back during Watergate. And I've devoted the last 20 years to researching articles and records at the National Archives, the internal documents of the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, and I've uncovered confidential internal documents that were taken by the top prosecutors when they left office. Improperly, our National Archives doesn't look kindly on taking records. And those surfaced in just the last 10 years. And I'm the first person to review them from 3 top lawyers, Leon Jaworski, the second special prosecutor, James Vorenberg, the criminal law professor from Harvard that was Archie Cox's first hire, and Phil Lacavara, the counsel to the special prosecutor. And these records, honest to Pete, Jake, they will curl your hair. They describe secret meetings between the judges and the prosecutors. Now, you don't have to have gone to Harvard Law School to understand that's a no-no. But one side is not allowed to meet with a judge in secret without the other side knowing. But I can show you written, documented proof of at least 10 meetings with Judge Sirica by different people. I can show you documented proof of evidence that would have been helpful to the defendants in the cover-up trial that was not shared with them. But there are rules on what the government can do or not do in prosecuting crimes. They have to play fair. If in the course of an investigation, the government runs across evidence that would be helpful to the defendants, they have to share it. That's the rule. Yep. But in Watergate, they did not share it. And I can show you 3 specific instances in that trial and the Plumbers trial that paralleled it, where they cheated, just outright cheated and left a paper trail. Mm-hmm. I can show you memos written on the decisions of who to indict or not indict in the cover-up case, where somehow only Republicans got indicted, even on very, very thin evidence, and Democrats on hugely in criminalizing records didn't get indicted because it would foul up the narrative. Mm-hmm. And the narrative was everybody at the White House is probably a criminal. It was a criminal enterprise. But other people who were involved, we don't worry about them because they'll foul up our story.
Yeah, it's insane the amount of corruption that the prosecutors were operating with. I mean, completely unethical the way they approached this case. But I want to backtrack to Watergate. I don't understand the reason for the break-in, because Nixon had won in 68 narrowly. The break-in occurred prior to the 72 election, but it was clear after such a successful first term, he was going to win in a landslide, and he did. He only lost Massachusetts and D.C. It's one of the biggest landslides in American history. So, I mean, why did they break into the DNC headquarters? It seems to me that they didn't really need to.
Well, the short answer is no one knows. And almost all of them are dead by now anyway, so we won't know. But I can give you several possibilities. One, the man who was recruited by John Dean, the president's lawyer, to prepare a campaign intelligence plan.
And this is Gordon Liddy, correct?
Gordon Liddy, okay. Yeah, leftover, a former FBI agent. Mm-hmm. Campaign intelligence sounds pretty reasonable, but it's not. It's a spy program to learn as much as possible about your opponent. Today, you would call it opposition research. Vice President Harris recently selected a vice president candidate of her own. Let me tell you, the Republicans were doing research on every single possible one, so they'd be ready to pounce whomever got chosen. Yep. The theory is you don't break the law in gathering that intelligence, but you want to know all about your opponent. Where's the big money coming from? What are the policy issues? Is there any dirt in their background? Well, the trouble with Gordon Liddy was his tendencies toward criminality came out. And he proposed a plan that envisioned mugging, bugging, kidnapping, and prostitution. And you could say, oh, you're just making that stuff up, Geoff. That's not possible. But Liddy wrote an autobiography years later called Will, the autobiography of Gordon Liddy. And he describes his plan in loving detail. He was proud of it. The name is Gemstone, and there's precious stones for each initiative that he had. So there's no question what he was proposing. And it was to show off. He was looking for a more senior appointment in the second term. So that's one reason. Just showing off. Another one is that the outcome of the 72 election wasn't known going into it. And at the moment of the break-in, or the plans were made for the break-in, there were other paths. McGovern was emerging as the candidate, but he hadn't been named. The Democratic National Convention hadn't occurred. Now, stick with me on this, Jake. You'll love it.
Okay.
Nixon believed the 1960 campaign was stolen from him, that the Kennedys cheated, but he decided not to challenge it. Okay?
Okay.
Bobby was his fearful opponent in 68, Robert Kennedy, but he got assassinated. That left one surviving Kennedy brother. And there wasn't time for Teddy, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, to step in 68. But there were lots of articles after Nixon got elected in 68 that said Teddy's going to run in 72 and he's going to bump Nixon off because Teddy brings with him the Kennedy political dynasty, the restoration of Camelot. Nixon was paranoid that that would come true. Fearsome competitors and charismatic and handsome and all this kind of stuff. So he would grab his staff. You can almost picture him grabbing them by the coat, the collar, of the suit, saying, "You're not worried enough about this election. What Teddy is going to do is skip the primaries because of Chappaquiddick, where Mary Jo Kopechne drowned. He's going to skip the primaries, but emerge at the convention and end up as the candidate." Now, if I told you that story a year ago, you'd say that's just not possible. Nobody could do that. Skip all the primaries and
in light
emerge
of today's
as the
events,
candidate?
it's possible.
Isn't that fun? There are parallels, and some of them are kind of cute to talk about. So there were people, lots of people at the campaign who were fearsome in their dedication to earning Nixon the biggest landslide he could possibly get. And maybe in their view, it was worth the risk to go break in and spy on the opposition. Nixon felt he'd been spied upon. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, told Nixon that LBJ had ordered Nixon's campaign plane to be bugged in the last 2 weeks of the 68 convention. Now, there's challenge about whether that was actually done, but there is no challenge that Hoover told Nixon he was ordered to do it. It is very clear from hearings that came out after Watergate that Lyndon Johnson's people demanded of Hoover in 1964 any derogatory information they had on Goldwater's top campaign assistants. And they got it. The FBI gave derogatory information to the Johnson campaign. And of course, in 1960, there's serious allegations of cheating. So it's not the idea of bugging was so far out in the atmosphere. I mean, I happen to think it was, but I wasn't involved in campaigns. The mess up, if you were to be cynical, is Gordon Liddy messed up the plan. He didn't have enough distance between the re-election committee and the break-in group. He actually sent in James McCord, one of the 5 guys caught red-handed, was head of security for the re-election committee. I mean, it got traced right back. The break-in is so botched and so reflective of Keystone Cops. There's lots of people who believe it was a setup by the CIA. There are books written about it.
Okay. Now here's where things get really foggy for me. But first, to play devil's advocate, wouldn't the latter theory that you suggested, that Nixon was paranoid that they were bugging him and they would install Kennedy as the candidate, wouldn't that theory suggest that Nixon was involved in the break-in? That he kind of ordered it because he was paranoid?
No. It's been 50 years.
Uh-huh.
It's never been shown. No witness has ever come forward to say Nixon knew about Liddy's campaign intelligence plan or had any knowledge of the break-in itself, nor Bob Haldeman, nor John Ehrlichman. Okay, no indication whatsoever. Never even been alleged. But one other thing is true that we know for sure, and that is that the CIA did know, because Gordon Liddy, our genius mastermind, whom I knew and thought was nuts at the time,
Yeah.
he was invited to do a presentation of his plan for budgetary reasons to the committee. He's recruited by John Dean. He shows up at the re-election committee, says, I've been promised $500,000, maybe $1 million for campaign intelligence plan. And the acting director says, well, nobody here can approve that kind of money. The only guy that could do that is John Mitchell. He's still Attorney General. He hasn't come over to the campaign. So let's go over to the Attorney General's office. You describe your plan to see if we can get his budgetary approval. Well, the charts, the display charts that Liddy used to present his plan were prepared by the CIA. When the arrests occurred, every single person involved, the 5 caught red-handed and the 2 masterminds, Liddy and Howard Hunt, all of them except Liddy had long-term connections with the Central Intelligence Agency.
Okay. See, that's where things get really sketchy for me, because if anyone doesn't know, the CIA is a foreign intelligence agency. Their job is to gather foreign intelligence for national security. What business does the CIA have being involved in domestic affairs relating to presidential campaigns?
Well, my friend, do you remember the Bob Newhart records when he would do fake interviews with people?
No, I do
He
not.
died recently. I'm older than you are. And one of them he did was talking to Abe Lincoln about the Gettysburg Address, about drafting it. Now try this, Abe. Try this. You can feel some of the people all of the time and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all of the time. And then there's a pause, and he says, well, we do it in different ways, Abe. That's how we do it. And so what you have, you tell me, it's against the law for the CIA to operate domestically.
Yes.
Well, except they do. Okay, we do it in different ways. They gave Howard Hunt, a career CIA operations officer, they gave him a wig, a voice-altering device, and a gait-altering device for his heel, so it looked like he had a limp, so he could sneak in and interview someone who was under political pressure. Gordon and Howard Hunt were going to reconnoiter a possible separate break-in, and the CIA gave them a camera, which the film could only be developed by the CIA, and they took pictures of where they were going to break in. So you can tell me, well, no, the CIA is not supposed to do this, but I can tell you the Church Committee, which was put together after Watergate, it was one of the great Watergate reforms to look at domestic intelligence, that the Church Committee hearings described domestic CIA operations. The FBI would, well, let me take one more step back. We have a 4th Amendment. The 4th Amendment prohibits unreasonable search and seizure without a court warrant.
Right.
Well, the issue is unreasonable. And for 40 years before Watergate, it was believed that the president's role as commander-in-chief to protect the nation from all enemies, foreign and domestic, gave him the personal authority to authorize break-ins without court approval. Okay? The FBI called them black bag jobs, usually to plant a bugging device or to photograph documents. and they did an average of 125 a year up until the end of the Johnson administration. The CIA called them surreptitious entries. Same thing, but they would plant stuff. Maybe they were foreigners operating in the United States. Maybe there were a lot of other excuses. There were also military intelligence groups conducting surveillance. They've got volumes about it from these. They were called the Church Committee, and it all came out after Nixon had resigned and after his people had been convicted and imprisoned, that the government was doing this stuff routinely for the previous 40 years.
That sounds completely illegal to me.
It is. It's not illegal. It's not illegal if the Justice Department doesn't prosecute. Haven't you noticed currently that people who don't give records to the Congress and are Republicans, like Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon, go to jail? Yeah. And other people who happen to be Democrats and don't give up records never get prosecuted?
Yeah. So you're saying this was completely corrupt from the beginning.
Well, what are we saying? Our government in the past, for a variety of reasons, has committed crimes? Yes. Okay. Do we try to keep it down to a low roar? Yes. Right. Was this hidden from the American public up until Watergate? Yes. All those things are true.
I don't understand how this isn't a bigger story. I mean, there should be national uproar over this. But so,
well, let me stand up for a second because I have one volume on my shelf. I just want to get it down.
Go ahead.
There are 4 books from the Church Committee. This is book 2. Okay.
Okay.
And this is from 1976. And it documents all of the improper domestic issues, domestic spying, and what the government was doing. And it all came out after Watergate. Those records are still sealed. Aside from these hearings, you can't get the evidence they gathered. They won't declassify it. And there's no, we talk about the Kennedy records being declassified. There's no schedule to declassify this stuff because what happened after Watergate, Hoover had died, Nixon had resigned, and Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, had been reassigned to be our ambassador to Iran. Mm-hmm. And the Congress starts holding these hearings thinking they're going to embarrass the Republican administration of Jerry Ford and what's left of the Nixon people. And the FBI starts answering their questions truthfully. And the CIA starts answering their questions truthfully. What foreign leaders did we try to assassinate? Well, there was Castro. There was Patrice Lumumba. There was, the coup we did down in Guatemala.
Quite a few.
This dirty laundry started getting washed and becoming public. And they ended up shutting the thing down. Now, I only say that not because it's proper to spy, but spying was going on before and after Nixon.
Yeah, for sure. So if the CIA is involved, so there's a couple different threads here. If Gordon Liddy, who is a madman, like you said, and who you believed was a madman, if he was hired to do this campaign intelligence and he was just trying to show off, why was the CIA involved? And if they are involved, what is their political motivation here? Because to tie a thread that makes me very skeptical, I don't know the timing of this tape, but there's a tape where Nixon is talking to the head of the CIA. I believe it's Helms. And he tells Helms, I know why they killed Jack, meaning JFK. And
I'm familiar with the issue. It just came up. This has not been around more than a year or two. And he says to Helms, I know who shot John. Okay?
Right.
But it's really, after the I know, there's a comma. And it's kind of saying, where's the beef? It's a phrase that you might use to describe an issue, and he wouldn't talk about President Kennedy as John. He would talk about him as Jack. And there have been analysis from competent academics that disprove this completely.
Okay.
He does not tell Helms he knows who shot Jack Kennedy. We think we know who shot Jack Kennedy, but what is so much fun about life is whenever there's a major event, there will always be unanswered questions, loose ends, and plenty of room for conspirators. So, did we really put a guy on the moon? Well, the shadow's going the wrong way. Did Jack Kennedy get assassinated by one man? Well, what about the grassy knoll?
Mm-hmm.
How the hell did a lone gunman get on a roof and pop off Trump's ear?
Yep.
There are so many mistakes and unanswered questions. That's going to be a conspiracy theory forever.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, we don't know why the CIA was involved in Watergate.
Well, we don't know for sure they were. We know that there are indications they were on the periphery. I mean, it also came out at the hearings that McCord was doing some work in New York and spilled the beans about the planned break-in, and a Democrat operative in New York wrote the committee and said they're coming after you. We don't know the specifics, but let me tell you, they're going to come plant bugs. And the Democrats are trying to say, well, we didn't take it seriously. And the other side is saying, well, you were tipped off. Who are you kidding? Now, there's a series of books. I call them the Doubter books. And it starts with Fred Thompson, who was minority counsel of the Irvin Committee. And it's called At That Point in Time. And he says, we had all these leads and they never turned out. You know, we couldn't get a grip on the CIA. This guy died of a heart attack the night before, Russell, and on and on. And then Len Kolodny publishes a book. No, James Hogan publishes a book called Secret Agenda. And he really lays out the case against the CIA. And it may or may not be true. I don't know. Then Len Kolodny publishes a book called Silent Coup. And he builds on the military spy ring that we know now existed in the White House and on the role that may or may not have been played by John Dean. So there's that whole group. But regardless of that, Jake, that's not what brought Nixon down.
Right.
What brought Nixon down was the prosecutors cheating, meeting secretly with the judges, destroying evidence and hiding it from the defendants. That's what crippled Nixon. Right. In secret, they told the House Judiciary Committee that Nixon had personally approved the payment of blackmail, except they couldn't prove it, so they cheated. And they kept it hidden. This is their report, their secret report called the Roadmap, that they sent to the Hill in 1974, March 1st, 1974. And it stayed secret until 2018. October 11th of 2018, it was unsealed in response to my court petition. Now, that means, as Nixon's defense team, we didn't know they were accusing Nixon of a personal crime. And you say, well, how can that be? You wouldn't have that.
Yeah.
But go ask Judge Meacham recently in New York. In order to get the statute of limitations extended, there had to be a felony. Well, he rules you don't have to say what the felony was. The jury just has to conclude it was one of three possibilities. What kind of nonsense is that? What kind of equal protection of the laws? What kind of due process is that? Well, that's what they did to Nixon. We have a hidden accusation. We didn't even know they'd made the accusation.
Wow. Okay, so to kind of sum this up so far to the best of my ability, so John Dean, Nixon's lawyer, hires Gordon Liddy and a couple other guys to run campaign intelligence. And Separate from the White House, part of the re-election committee, Gordon Liddy and these guys, they devise a plan to gather campaign intelligence by breaking in to the DNC headquarters.
Well, no, wait,
So
no,
they,
wait, no, wait. I don't mean to interrupt, but John Dean hires Gordon Liddy. Liddy does the rest of the hiring. Okay, it's not Dean was in on the rest of it.
okay,
And from the break-in arrests, from that moment forward, people at the re-election committee are in deep doo-doo.
right.
But we thought people on the White House staff were clear because Dean told us they were clear. And you were a little ambiguous when you were going through that. But yes, as it evolves, if you were at the campaign committee, you were great risk. Mm-hmm. Who knew? What did they know? What were they sharing the fruits of the break-ins with? If you're on the White House staff, pretty much you were oblivious. You had other responsibilities.
Exactly. So the campaign, the CRP, the guys who break in, they're caught red-handed. The White House isn't necessarily involved, but it inevitably kind of bleeds over into the White House. Nixon has no idea about this. He's unaware of the break-in. When does Nixon find out about this, and what's his reaction?
Well, we're going to do it at two levels. The first level is, when does Nixon learn about the break-in and the arrests? Uh-huh. He's down in Florida, and he reads about them in the Sunday morning papers. Wow. And his reaction was, who would be so stupid to break in the DNC headquarters? Comes back to the White House. Bob Haldeman meets with him for the first time in front of a recording device. Remember, we learned later Nixon's bugged the Oval Office. And he meets with Bob Haldeman on June 20th, 1972. There's an 18-minute gap. Haldeman's notes at that point, his famous yellow pad, has the word Watergate, nothing else. We don't know what was said because the recording device has a buzz on it. Now, we don't have to get into it because we just don't know. Yeah. But that's one of three most significant tapes. 3 days later, June 23rd, Haldeman comes in and says, the investigation is going in a new direction we don't want it to go. And Nixon says, well, what do you mean? He says, well, they're tracing the money. And if they trace the money, they're going to get to people we don't want to be involved. And Nixon says, well, would that be Morris Stans? That's his finance chairman at the committee. And Haldeman says, no, it's somebody else. It's Ken Dahlberg. And Nixon says, who the hell is Ken Dahlberg? He's never heard the name before. And then there's another name. We'll get it later today. Well, that particular tape recording stayed unheard, secret, until July 24th, 1974, when the Supreme Court ruled an additional 64 tapes had to be given to the prosecutors, and Nixon directed his top defense lawyer to go listen to a particular tape. Okay? June 23rd, 1972. Fred Buzhardt was the lawyer, my boss, listened to the tape, was appalled because what they hear on the tape is Haldeman saying it's John Dean's idea that the way we turn off this FBI interview is to get the CIA to tell the FBI it's one of ours, so leave them alone. Fred Buzhardt mistakenly interpreted that as meaning Nixon was in on the cover-up from day one and demanded that tape be released to the public. And it was released to the public on August 5th. Nixon announced his resignation 3 days later. So people who know something about Watergate will tell you, well, of course, Nixon was involved in the cover-up. When it became known, he resigned. Turns out, many years later, they misunderstood the tape. Now, I'm involved in this.
This is, of course, the infamous smoking gun tape you're talking about.
Absolutely. I'm the third person to hear the tape. I'm the one who prepared the transcript, and I'm the one who called it the smoking gun. And it's very nice because I'm in Woodward's book called The Final Days, and they're tracing back where that name came from. And the last person, I wouldn't talk to him, but the last person they get to is me, which is true. I called it the smoking gun, keen off of Fred Buzhardt's reaction. Well, we were wrong. They were trying to protect the identities of two very, very prominent Democrats who made substantial contributions to Nixon's reelection on the absolute assurance it would never become public. And the trouble was the FBI, in their direction, we don't want it to go, they traced the money back to CRP. They were gone anyway. Mm-hmm. They were starting to ask how the money got to CRP in the first place. And that would disclose these donors. So it was a political decision. But we didn't know it. The public misunderstood it. And Dean, whose idea it was, kept his mouth shut and watched it be misinterpreted. Then he published a book in 2014, 45 years later. And in a footnote at page 55, he says, funny thing, the smoking gun has been misunderstood all this time. If they really knew it wasn't illegal, it wasn't involved, and this is the end of his footnote, had Nixon known, he might have lived to fight again another day. In short, the smoking gun was shooting blanks. But that's what drove Nixon from office. That's why he resigned.
Yeah.
But he was already on the ropes. He was already on the ropes because the prosecutors had, in secret, said to the House Judiciary Committee that Nixon had personally ordered the payment of blackmail. That's on the third most important tape, March 21st, 1973. Happen to have the transcript right here. Yes. John Dean goes in to see the president and says, Mr. President, there's a cancer near the presidency. It's growing, it's compounding, and it's getting worse. And you're going to have to make some decisions, and you don't know what I know. People have been committing perjury. More people are going to have to commit perjury, and we're being blackmailed. Meeting goes on for an hour and a half, and they sort out what the options are. And one of the options is hunker down, circle the wagons, and don't help anybody. And the other is, in the end, it's going to come out anyway. Maybe it would be better to come out now. Maybe we call the blackmail's bluff and go about it another way. And in the course of that conversation, it's an Oval Office tape. We have it. I've transcribed it. He says, how much would it cost if we started paying these guys? How much would it cost over time? Because Hunt's only asking for $120,000 now. But what about over time? And Dean says, probably exceed $1 million. And Nixon says, well, I could raise $1 million. I know where it could be found. And people are saying, well, that's his decision to pay the payment. But it's not. He goes on to say that the money's not the problem, it's the delivery. And once you start paying, there's no end. The blackmailer will never go away. They'll bleed you to death for the rest of their life. Yeah. And the only decision made at that meeting is to get John Mitchell down from New York, get everybody in the room, and decide what to do. John Dean himself, the president's principal accuser, has never said Nixon decided to pay the blackmail. He's never said that. And if you go through this line by line, because remember, I transcribe these things, and you look for it, he never says, let's do it. Later that day, there was another meeting. They now know Mitchell is coming. He's going to meet with them the next day. And Nixon announces his decision. You got to look for it, but it's there. The way we're going to beat Hunt's blackmail demand, because if we don't pay, he's going to disclose something. We disclose it ourselves. Then he can't blackmail us. And we're going to tell Mitchell tomorrow that's what we're going to do. And when we tell Mitchell we're going to do that and we do it, Mitchell will have to walk the plank and Mitchell will be the one who takes the fall. And Nixon doesn't want to do that. But in that subsequent tape on the next day, that's what happens. Now, the prosecutors don't like that answer. They say, no, no, no. On March 21st, he decided to pay the blackmail because, and then I'll be through, because he learns about it at a meeting starting at 12:30. It ends at noon, and I'll be a son of a gun that very night at 10 o'clock, a payment is made to Howard Hunt's lawyer. So to the prosecutors, it's self-evident.
Right.
We don't have to prove anything, just follow the chain. But they can't prove it segment by segment. Doesn't line up right. And so they lied about it. And I'm the one that uncovered the lies.
Yeah, this was something that the prosecutors were putting a lot of their chips on, at least up until the smoking gun tape came out, that Nixon was the one who ordered this payoff of Hunt, but you're saying that there's no proof that he did.
You have it exactly right. They didn't have anything before the smoking gun tape came out. If events had proceeded, if Nixon hadn't resigned, the fight in court or before the House Judiciary Committee would have been over what was said on March 21st and the action Nixon took after that meeting. And I think we would have won, and that Nixon would not have been found to have been involved in the cover-up and be involved in the approval of that payment. And by the way, the payment was only made for Howard Hunt's legal fees. The part of what he asked for, which was the blackmail part, was never paid anyway. But that's lost in the wash.
That was like he asked for an additional $60,000 for living expenses or something.
Well, what he does, he asks for it, the number bounces. It's 120, 125, 130. It's 72,000 of outstanding legal bills and 50,000 prepayment of living expenses. But you see, that's what switched it from humanitarian aid to blackmail. He wanted to be prepaid because his point was, next Friday, I'm going to be sentenced and I'm going to be led away to prison and my family will be at risk. My wife recently died in a plane accident. I have a special needs daughter. I want money up front because you guys don't pay on time. And he says, Hunt maintains that he never threatened blackmail. He never threatened to disclose the earlier Fielding break-in. He just said, you guys aren't treating me fairly. You know, I've spent my career with an agency that takes care of its own. What I was doing what you wanted me to do.
Okay, interesting. I want to get more into the Special Prosecution Force and Judge Sirica, who just operated completely unethically and very corrupt. So following, once the prosecution ramps up, this what you call, it's really a partisan army of special prosecutors are recruited, and you say they have the main goal of just taking Nixon down.
Yes, so that's what I say. Yeah.
So
you
how
totally understand my argument?
Yeah. So how is this special prosecution force recruited, assembled? What are their political motives? How are they acting with secrecy and corruption and all this stuff?
Let us go to the beginning. We'll start at the very beginning. Do, re, mi. Okay?
Okay.
On April 30th, 1973, Nixon announces the resignations of Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, and his decision to appoint Elliot Richardson to succeed Kleindienst as Attorney General. Elliot Richardson held lots of positions in the Nixon administration and lots of positions in Massachusetts before he got there. A liberal Republican, he'd been U.S. Attorney, been Lieutenant Governor, been Attorney General of Massachusetts. He was Undersecretary of State. He was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. He'd just been confirmed as Secretary of Defense. He had the perfect resume to someday run for president. He was also totally uninvolved in Watergate. Mm-hmm. So Nixon wanted him to be a totally clean attorney general. We're going to play this thing straight. Richardson wanted no part of it because he would have to choose which prominent Republicans to prosecute. He didn't want the job, but Nixon prevailed upon him. So in the course of the confirmation hearings, controlled by Senator Kennedy, the Senate Judiciary Committee made certain demands. They demanded that there be a special prosecutor and that they create from scratch a Watergate special prosecution force. And what they negotiated with Elliot Richardson was a proposed regulation that is nicknamed the guidelines for this newly created special prosecution force. Now, come forward 50 years, there's a prosecutor down in Florida and in Washington, D.C., who's prosecuting Trump. And the judge down in Florida said, you're not prosecuting him under any statute, and you haven't been confirmed by the Senate, so you're not a lawfully appointed prosecutor. Go back 50 years, that's what they did. We didn't challenge it at the time. Same exact thing. At the behest of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Elliot Richardson agreed to a set of guidelines that provided total independence for a special prosecution force, and he agreed to appoint a head whom the committee approved. Okay, he wasn't confirmed. Mm-hmm. And he picks his labor law lawyer from Harvard Law School, a guy named Archibald Cox. Yep. Cox comes up with Richardson, is subject to the hearing. They approve Richardson. Richardson gets sworn in. He appoints Cox special prosecutor. Cox's first appointment is a fellow Harvard law professor named James Vorenberg, who does teach criminal law. And Vorenberg takes it upon himself to do all the hiring for Archie and to take notes of developments during the course of their existence so he could write the report when they were through. Okay? Mm-hmm. So he hires against a budget that was extracted from the Department of Justice, from within, not an act of Congress, from within the Department of Justice, that envisions 92 newly hired employees. Okay, the table of organization and employment, 92 slots. They didn't announce this. And then he sets about hiring. And there isn't time to do full field investigations or FBI clearances, so he only hires his friends or friends of friends. They happen to be people who went through Harvard Law School because that's where he teaches, that's where he's from. Right. When the smoke cleared, and the previous Department of Justice under Kennedy and Johnson, when the smoke clears, the top 17 officers or attorneys in the Watergate Special Prosecution Force all worked for the Kennedy-Johnson Department of Justice. Okay, so what you have is a constitutional inversion. The people who lost power when Nixon was elected in 1968, the Democrats, are now back in charge of the administration that beat them, and they have the sole investigatory and prosecution power. So they announce at their first press conference they're going to investigate every single allegation of wrongdoing made against the Nixon administration since it assumed office in 1969. This is not Watergate, okay? This is everything we can throw you at. We're going to interpret the law. This is lawfare. We're going to aggressively reinterpret the law to wipe you guys out. And they hire most of the middle-aged, mid-career gunslingers. Many of them come out of the Southern District of New York, where they made their bones prosecuting the mob. and they treat the Nixon White House the same way you treat the mob. We'll just pressure you till you break. We don't care what we do to your family. This was a criminal enterprise. You had motive because you were for Nixon. You had ability because you worked in the White House. If you mislicked a stamp, we're going to get you. And the bottom group of people, the younger people, my age, they were all people who hated Nixon because of the Vietnam War. So we have, and then we invited Archibald Cox to leave in an event called the Saturday Night Massacre. Okay?
Right. Yep.
They bring in a new special prosecutor. The special prosecutor's name is Leon Jaworski.
Yep.
And the group that Vorenberg had recruited, these are all Harvard or Ivy League lawyers, hate Nixon. They titled their phone directory the best and the brightest. They called themselves Cox's Army. And when we fired Archibald Cox, they adopted a scorched earth prosecution policy. We're going to take out everybody. And Jaworski, who comes in, actually writes his deputy and says, I can't work with this staff. This staff is holding meetings before they come to see me to discuss an issue, so I only get one point of view. And I've warned you about this before, but there's this undercurrent that the president must be reached at all costs. That's in writing, Jake, in a memo he wrote his deputy. Now, what happened, the three top prosecutors take their records with them. So we didn't know about any of this stuff. And the stuff didn't start to surface until just the last 10 years. So now we have written paper trail of wrongdoing. We have secret meetings, secret memos, secret coordination by and between individuals in all three branches of government that were going to take Nixon down by any means, fair or foul. The surprising thing is they left this paper trail, and I got the paper trail.
Yeah, I'm no expert in criminal justice or law or anything, but it seems to me that when you're prosecuting or any sort of courtroom issues, the objective should be to get to the truth, right? It seems to me that their sole goal wasn't to get to the truth. I mean, they were sort of making up their own reasons for why Nixon was guilty just to get Nixon.
Let's go to today, just briefly. And I know nothing about today except what I read in the newspapers. Right. There are 5 pending cases against Trump: Florida, Georgia, New York, and Washington, D.C. And it looks like the top prosecutor from the Department of Justice somehow ends up for a local DA in New York to go after Trump. It looks like the lead prosecutor in Georgia comes and meets with White House counsel in Washington, D.C. So people suspect that there may be coordination by and between these groups. What's interesting, when you go back 50 years, it's not a suspicion. We have a paper trail. I've uncovered the paper trail. Picture a triangle, okay? Each of the 3 angles represents one branch of government. Mm-hmm. Just say the top one is the executive branch. I can prove to you through official papers kept at the National Archives that the prosecutors were meeting with the judges and on at least 10 occasions. And they wrote down what they talked about and what they would have concluded and where that was going to go. Go down to one of the lower angles, say on the right side. There are 3 judges, 3 federal judges, and I can prove they met secretly the prosecutors. Okay? Judge Sirica, who appointed himself to preside, Judge Gazette, who handled the Plumbers trials, and Circuit Court Judge David Bazelon. And then on the other side, there's the legislative branch. You've got the Senate Judiciary Committee that confirmed Richardson, the Senate Irvin Committee which is just like the J6, and the House Judiciary Committee that handled Nixon's impeachment. Now, let me make two more observations, then we'll go back. The Ervin Committee is very much like the J6 Committee today. A majority of Democrats. Nixon had no defender on the committee. Lowell Weicker, one of the nominal Republicans, said the only reason he joined was to sink Nixon. And they only investigated the 72 campaign, not 68, not 64, my God, not 60. The J6 committee has the same thing. Nominal Republicans, but no Trump supporters. We're not going to investigate why there was no security. We're not going to investigate why these people are going crazy, arresting and prosecuting 1,300 individuals. Why were there no fences? Why was there? Trump offered 10,000 National Guard troops. Why not? Well, because the Democrats don't want to know. Go back to the judges. This is you'll love this story. Archibald Cox, the first special prosecutor, becomes so concerned that Judge Sirica is making so many pro-prosecution rulings that they'll win at trial, but they'll get reversed on appeal because the defendants didn't receive the due process of law guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment. So he goes to see the chief judge of the appellate panel, his friend, in secret. And he says, Sirica's really out on the wild side. So we don't want you guys to reverse. And here's how you can do it. You can stack the deck of the judges on appeal to make sure Sirica's never reversed. Now, that appeals court, the D.C. Circuit, throughout Watergate had only 9 judges, just like the Supreme Court, but only 9 judges. 5 of whom were very, very liberal and controlled by the chief judge. 4 of whom were not liberal. There were a couple conservative Democrats and a couple of Nixon appointees. Mm-hmm. On any standard 3-judge panel, which is what you get on an appeal, statistically, you could end up with 2 Republicans. And they might reverse Sirica. Well, they would be big trouble. But if the appeals were heard by the full court all at once, unprecedented, but if we did it that way, the 5 liberals would always prevail. That's what you should do. And sure enough, in all 12 criminal appeals from Judge Sirica's cases, they're heard by the 9-judge panel. It's called sitting en banc from the outset. And in Latin, because we love Latin, it's called sua sponte en banc. From the beginning, all 9 judges, and amazingly, Sirica's upheld in all the cases. Why do we, aside from the fact it's self-evident this has never been done before or since in any circuit court in our nation's history, there's another reason we know. That's because Bazelon's law clerk was in the room at the time Cox called on Bazelon. And he told one person years later of this terrible wrong. Yep. That person was a partner in his law firm who was about to be sworn in to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. That person happened to be Deputy Attorney General during Watergate and my good friend, Judge Larry Silberman, recently passing away. And Silberman told me of this conversation. I remember where we were and when it was, and it was in the lobby of a club, and I said, "My God, that's the missing link." And because what he said was, "Can you imagine the much vaunted Archibald Cox of the Harvard Law School privately calling on the chief judge of the very panel that's going to review his cases?" And I said, "Well, that's the missing link." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I can show Sirica did all these crazy things, but he's always upheld on appeal. Now I know why." And Larry said, "You can't quote me. I'm already controversial enough. Don't, this is a private conversation. And I worked, that was 2008. And I worked for the next 14 years trying to convince him to allow me to say this. And we even went back to look at the clerk's records of how it came about. Larry said, you can't just meet en banc because the chief judge wants you to. There has to be a vote. There has to be a discussion. And he asked the clerk for the record from years before. Clerk reported back there was no record. Astonishing, there was no record. And then, as Larry got toward the end of his life, he suggested to me, when my third book, the one there by your right hand, when that came out, I went to see Larry and asked for some help in publicizing it. And he said, you should put on a seminar for the Federalist Society and with all that you've uncovered. And I said, will you participate? And he looks off in the distance and he says, yes, I will participate in your seminar. And just before we did the seminar, we did it about a year ago, it's on tape. He says, now, let's go over what you want me to say during this discussion, in addition to that Bazelon meeting. And he'd flipped. He wanted that on record, this story of how the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit corrupted the appellate's process in Watergate. So what you've got, secret meetings, secret memos, secret coordination by and between all three branches with a paper trail that proves it. Now, maybe 50 years from today, we'll find out there was secret coordination against Trump, but we now know it, secret coordination against Nixon and his top people. You know, if you're going to have a fair trial, you need a fair and objective judge. Sirica was neither fair nor objective. You need even-handed, nonpartisan prosecutors. They were neither even-handed nor were they nonpartisan. You need a jury pool that's untainted by adverse pretrial publicity and unbiased politically, and we had neither. And you need an appellate court that is equally fair and objective, and we had none of those things. And we now know it. So you ask, what's going to come from this? What's the outcome? What's the therefore?
Yeah.
I've got 3 books. I've done a documentary that summarizes this and shows it. And I've got all these documents laid out in detail on my website. I mean, you can go every single document I've mentioned. And I've also, I turn for just a second, I've put together a spiral-bound notebook of the 24 most egregious internal memos that we prepared for a presentation that we did at the Hoover Institution out at Stanford. So we've got the full records. We're thinking there might be a change in management at the Department of Justice after the next election. We've already asked this Department of Justice to look into this corruption from 50 years ago. Documented corruption, wrongdoing in the biggest criminal case, political case in our nation's history. And they've turned us down. They've said, no, we won't even look. They didn't say we looked and there's nothing there. They said, we don't think this is important enough for us to look at all. Well, if you got a new Department of Justice, new management, and they said, we think you really ought to take a look. I mean, look what this guy's uncovered. We believe the Department of Justice would be forced to come into court and disown those convictions. The other thing we want, Jake, is really unique to Richard Nixon. When they brought out the cover-up indictments on March 1st, 1974, they named Nixon an unindicted co-conspirator. Okay? Mm-hmm. That's separate from the roadmap, separate from going up to the Hill to get impeached. They said that he was a co-conspirator, that they could prove his involvement. 2018, when I finally got the roadmap unsealed, Turned out they didn't have the proof. They didn't have the allegation, done in secret. We want to know what Leon Jaworski told the grand jury to convince the grand jury to name Nixon a co-conspirator. We don't think he had any specific allegation. We don't think it's there. But that's been hidden for 55 years. We've never been able to learn that. We asked for it when the allegation first came out, when the Nixon was named. They said, no, it's got to be secret. That's grand jury. We asked for it 30 years later when they unsealed Nixon's grand jury testimony. And we asked for it when I got the roadmap unsealed in 2018. The other half of my petition said, we want to see what Jaworski said. And the department called me up and said, you know, Geoff, you won on the roadmap, but we've been asked to prepare the order declining disclosure of the grand jury. And I said, well, that's no fair. This is not witness testimony. This is what they said. So we're sorry. This is where the judge is. And I said, what if I withdraw the motion? They said, okay, we'll let you do that. We'll say this part has never been decided. So we could go back to the Department of Justice after January 20th, 2025, and say, we want you to arrange for unsealing of this testimony. If we were to prevail, I believe to the very bottom of my soul, there was no specific allegation of wrongdoing against Nixon. I think Jaworski went in and said, we've given you this evidence over the past 2 months. We now are asking you to vote. And they never, ever specified what the action was, the personal action that Nixon was alleged to have created.
Well, I hope you do prevail, because that would, answer a lot of questions. But to sum up here, you have the special prosecution force. They're secretly meeting with the judge. They're not revealing critical information like the roadmap to the defense team. So the defense team doesn't even know what they're accusing Nixon of. They're rigging the appeals process to have all 9 judges from the D.C. court on appeal as opposed to the regular 3, because Sirica is oftentimes overturned. And what's crazy to me is they write this all down.
Yeah.
How do they not? How does this not blow up in their face?
We call that hubris. This overweening pride that goeth before the fall. Jaworski in particular, these are self-dictated memos to his file describing his secret meetings with a judge.
Yeah.
And was it that he knew he was going to write a book and he was keeping contemporary notes? Was it he wanted this stuff to come out, but not when he was still alive? Was it that he was so proud of his own actions, he wanted that to be recorded? I mean, go back to the role of the press in this, because we really haven't covered Woodward fairly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please.
He has this source. It turns out they calls his source Deep Throat. And the implication all along was that his source worked on the White House staff. And we learned 30 years later his source was a disgruntled officer from the FBI, Mark Fell. But Bob Woodward knew that wasn't true and allowed and encouraged the American public to believe it was Nixon's White House staff. This is not only dishonorable, this is corrupt. This is absolute corruption. Now,
100%.
He's supposed to be the greatest investigative reporter of all time, but how do you get credit for investigative reporting when all you are doing is publishing what the government already knows? Mm-hmm. The lead FBI agent on all of Watergate, Angelo Lano, said on an oral history given to the National Archives in 2007, they said, what about Woodward and Bernstein? He said, they didn't help us a bit. It didn't help you a bit. He said, no, they're publishing what we already knew. So the archivist says, well, didn't they give you any leads? He says, no, not a one. Did we give them leads? We gave them thousands, but they didn't help us. Then you have the interview with a grand juror. It was alleged they approached a grand juror, and and Sirica lost his temper. They dispatched their lawyer, Edward Bennett Williams, down to calm Sirica down. And Williams says, look, no harm, no foul. The juror wouldn't talk to him. So it's okay. 2014, a book gets published where the author came across in Ben Bradley's files 7 pages of typed notes from a Carl Bernstein interview with a grand juror. They've been lying about it for 40 years. And once again, written proof that Woodward and Bernstein, this happy group of heroes, are common liars. And finally, you have the interview of Leon Jaworski. Jaworski resigns early, goes back to Texas, and the first interview he gives to the press is December 5th, 1974. The cover-up trial is still going on. We have Woodward's typed notes from that interview. And in the second sentence of the first paragraph on the top page of his notes, the sentence says there were lots of one-on-one conversations that only he and the other party know about. Now roll that around in your mind for a second. What on earth is Jaworski talking about? Conversations only he and the other party know about. That's his secret meetings with Judge Sirica. He wanted to tell Woodward what he'd been doing. And Woodward doesn't follow up then or later because it would have ruined his narrative. Woodward, the greatest investigative reporter of all time, punts on what would have been the greatest scandal of all time, the cheating by the special prosecutors.
So you could say journalistic malpractice.
To say the least. To say the least.
Yeah, Nixon always did say that, I mean, at this time, it was CBS, ABC, and NBC, they're all leftist media establishments. Nixon always claimed that the media hated him. I know after he lost his 62 governor race, I think I forget the exact quote, but he basically said, I'm retiring from public life. The media will no longer have anything to report on.
He loses to Pat Brown, and he says, well, gentlemen, you will not have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because this is my last press conference. Yeah. It was not just only 3 networks. It was also 2 very powerful weekly news magazines, Newsweek and Time, and the dominant national newspaper, the New York Times. All 6 of those organizations are headquartered within 6 blocks of each other of Midtown Manhattan. So you not only got a single narrative, it was the New York point of view. And today we suspect the New York point of view. We don't think that reflects the nation. But boy, did it reflect a hatred of Richard Nixon.
Yeah, it's no wonder that the American public thought Nixon was a crook and guilty because they only saw the one side of the story. But
they only got one story.
Yeah, forgive me. We might go a little bit over 2 hours, but there's a couple other points I want to touch on. You were there. I was at the White House recently. I toured the White House for the channel here, and I was in the East Room, and I was looking at some notable events that happened in the East Room, and one of them was Nixon's farewell address to his staff after he resigned the presidency, and you were there. You were in that room. What was that like? What was the scene in that room? How was Nixon's demeanor?
Well, it was surreal. It was surreal. He'd announced in a nationwide address the night before that he would resign at noon the next day. So the East Room has got all these chairs and huge media at the back. And I came in a little late, and the chairs were all taken, and I wouldn't have sat anyway because I was somewhat keyed up. So I was standing, and he came in, and there's a standing ovation because the president has entered the room. and he brings his family up to the stage. And I thought, wow, this is really cruel. He's demanded the family be there with him so he's not facing it alone. And then he gives a very personable speech. This is the first time he's ever been seen with glasses in public. And it's right from the heart. And he ends with this idea that you can't hate your enemies, because if you hate them, they win, and you'll ruin yourself. And I thought, what pablum, who wrote this for him? And then it turns out I'm completely wrong. Now, remember, I'm part of the legal team that drove him from office because of misunderstanding of the smoking gun.
Right.
And it turns out his family demanded to be there, and they didn't want him to resign anyway. And then it turns out he's really speaking from the heart. He's really he came from nowhere. He's a simple family. He believes in truth, justice, and the American way. And I'm leaving. Your president, I'm leaving, but you have to stay. And you've got to do your job without hatred or revenge. And he goes out and he gets on the helicopter, gives that sign,
Yep.
A last act of defiance, and takes off. We gather back 15 minutes later or so in the East Room to see Jerry Ford sworn in, as the subsequent president. And he says the long national nightmare of Watergate is over. And we go about deciding what to do with our lives. Now, we had a litigation staff under James St. Clair, who was the court lawyer, and we had the inside staff under Fred Buzhardt, and I was Fred's deputy. But I had interviewed and hired all of St. Clair's staff. So about a day and a half after Nixon's gone, I called up my friend Larry Silberman, Deputy Attorney General, and I said, Larry, we got to get these lawyers out of here before the press discovers Nixon's defense team is still reporting for work in the EOB.
Yeah.
And he says, let me call you back. And he calls back later that afternoon. He says, we have space at the Department of Justice. We have just finished rehabilitating, but not assigned to another unit. So we can house these people, have them come over tomorrow morning. And he meets with them. And he says, look, you acted honorably. You did not do anything wrong. So sit here and think about the rest of your life. And if you want to do something in government, come see me and I'll write your recommendation if you want to stick around. And if you want to go apply for jobs elsewhere, I'll be your main character reference, which was really, really noble of him to do. Then I went down to see Jim St. Clair, who was going back to Boston, and he was not happy. He left almost within the next day or two. And he said, it's no wonder the wheels kept coming off, because we were defending an indefensible series of actions. Very bitter. Now, he thought he was going to become Nixon's next attorney general. Nixon had discussed it with him. I didn't know that, but I learned that later. And then I just smoothly transitioned back into associate director of general government. I was gonna be named deputy counsel with a formal appointment. And Buzhardt said at one point, Geoff, the way this is going, you might be smarter to stay on your current payroll. So I just evolved back in, reporting for duty. And upon reflection, Buzhardt never wrote a single memo to me or about me. My name never came up, even though I'd been his deputy all along.
Yeah.
Transcribed the tapes, ran the document rooms, briefed the presidential counselors. I was right smack in the middle of it.
Yeah, you got I mean, I must say, quite lucky you were able to just carry on with your life, which a lot of your colleagues were not. But are there any possible alternatives that could have played out in which Nixon wouldn't have resigned? I mean, what if he didn't resign?
Well, at the time he resigned, he'd lost the capacity to govern. His uh, uh, impeachment by the House was a foregone conclusion. The Republicans couldn't find enough votes in the Senate to prevent a conviction. So he would have been convicted. Now,
Hmm.
the Senate has never convicted any president. It's a historic fact. 5 impeachments, never a conviction.
Hmm.
But the odds are against it. There are about 1,000 exits of what might have happened.
Yeah, you could play what if all day.
I knew Gordon Liddy from Treasury. I thought he was a madman then. I violently opposed his being hired onto the White House staff. Remember, I'm a very junior guy,
Yeah.
and I lost that battle. Maybe if I'd tried a little bit harder and Gordon had never been hired, sent over someplace else to the Department of Justice or something like that. Um, Maybe if Bud Krogh hadn't decided to do the plumbers break in themselves, maybe if they'd convinced the FBI to go do it, maybe it would have been successful.
Yeah.
Maybe if the Cuban who was supposed to pick the lock had been able to pick the lock so they didn't break in and leave a police record. Uh, Maybe if John Dean
Yeah.
hadn't been assigned the campaign intelligence plan.
I think maybe if anyone would have spoken up about the smoking gun tape and the truth about it, because there were a small handful of guys that did know what Nixon meant with the smoking gun.
Only one, John Dean.
If he would have spoken up, I guess
John
that's an
John
avenue.
had no interest whatsoever in speaking up,
Yeah.
my friend.
Yeah, but
Let
yeah,
me
that wasn't
let
going to
me
happen.
read something to you because you're a nice guy. Happens to be right here on my desk. I got this 2 weeks ago. This is a news article from the Fort Myers News Press, a newspaper maybe near you, dated Sunday, November 7th, 1976. Okay? This is the week after Jerry Ford has lost the election for president. And there's an interview going on of John Dean. And it's a long interview, but this is the relevant part. The reporter says, do you suppose any modern president is truly innocent of impeachable offenses? And Dean says, I have no personal knowledge of any prior president committing an act. I suspect there has been lying, but not under oath. It's kind of curious to analyze Nixon's offenses. He's not chargeable for the crime of conspiracy to obstruct justice. But when did he enter the conspiracy? As early as June 20th, when the 18-minute gap occurred, or on June 23rd, when he instructed Haldeman to have the CIA call the FBI and shut off the investigation of Mexican money, the so-called smoking gun tape. Well, I don't happen to think that was the smoking gun of Watergate, despite what the press said. Knowing the facts as I do, I doubt the June 23rd tape would be considered obstruction of justice in court. Why not? The reporter asks. The president was trying to block an investigation into potentially illegal campaign contributions, not the Watergate investigation itself. I'd been told earlier by the head of the criminal division that the FBI investigation was restricted to the break-in alone. Haldeman reported that to the president. So if you consider the limits of the FBI inquiry and what Nixon was blocking, this is that FBI investigation, his actions on June 23rd don't fit into the obstruction of justice category. The smoking gun was only firing blanks. And then the reporter says, I've never heard that interpretation before. And Dean says, well, I'm sure you haven't. It's the first time I mentioned it.
And no one thought it would have been important to look into that.
To say the least. But this obscure, maybe it was a weekly, I don't know. And it just surfaced to me 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
And Dean has said, he said in the deposition in the case, Dean versus St. Martin's Press, he said, that the tape has always been misunderstood. And he says, I've always maintained that. And this is proof he had. Now, he will sit, even today, he will sit at a table where somebody says the smoking gun proves Nixon cheated, and he won't correct them. Okay? He just stands silent. Now, we have this phrase today, silence is violence. Well, that's what he's doing. I went back and I looked up the court transcript because they're cross-examining John Dean over this smoking gun tape. It's suddenly become the centerpiece of their case against Nixon and Haldeman and Ehrlichman. And Haldeman's attorney, John Wilson, Haldeman knows damn well it was politically to protect the Democrat money because he was the one, Dean told, he was the one meeting with the president. Mm-hmm. And so his lawyer is cross-examining John Dean and saying, wasn't this political? And instead of saying what he said in what I just read you, Dean says, well, they were worried about Gordon Liddy's involvement. Now, that's true. But when you get sworn as a witness, you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God. John Dean violated that oath, told partial truth. Yeah. But of course, he gets away with it. He always gets away with it. Nobody knows. But I got to tell you, that news article is fascinating.
Uh-huh. That even way back when he was saying that. But, I mean, to say it lightly, he seems like a slimy individual in all of this. But
he is, the FBI called him the master manipulator. Conrad Black, in his biography, calls him the most slippery of the Watergate characters. I prefer the phrase arch villain.
Yeah, I think those are all accurate.
He is at the very center. He and Gordon Liddy, the very center of the wrongdoing. Gordon does 6 years. John Dean walks free.
Yeah, that's amazing to me how Dean walked free. But let's look to the future. How should we view Watergate in hindsight going forward into the future? What lessons can we take away as the American public from Watergate moving forward?
I think there are 3 things. You put your finger on it earlier. It's the pursuit of truth. Now, truth is bandied about. In the fireplace at Whittier College over the administration building, they have a quote from John Greenleaf Whittier. And it is, early hath life's mighty question, thrilled within thy heart of youth, which with a deep and strong beseeching, what and where is truth? And then you go to Harvard, and every symbol they have is veritas. It's Latin for truth, because it's Harvard. But it's on the symbol of every single one of their schools. And there's an implication, which is disowned by some today, that there is an absolute truth. Our effort is to strive to uncover it. But truth is not malleable. Truth is not occasionally used. Mm-mm. So the pursuit of truth is hugely important in politics, in life, in everything we do. 100%. Second, what is absolutely key to our future is a vibrant and independent press. We didn't have it then. You're closer to it today. It's divided. But even back in colonial times, the press was divided. But you have a fair shot today about reading more about some particular issue, particularly if you go to several different sources. We didn't have alternate views. We didn't have podcasts. We didn't have talk radio. We didn't have Fox News or Newsmax or America Online. We didn't have dissent or the ability to communicate on the internet like we do today. Now, it's possible there's too much information. It's possible it's so chaotic you can't sort it out. But if you're willing to put the effort in, we're going to see if a candidate can be invented out of nowhere and a previous documented record can be dismissed as unimportant because we'll tell you what we think after we get into office. We're reminded of Nancy Pelosi's comment on Obamacare. We got to pass the law to learn what's in it. Well, we're talking about a candidate. We got to elect
the president of the United States.
We're joyful. I don't think it'll stand, but you've got not just political people supporting that, but you've got members of the press up and down the line towing that because they want so desperately to keep somebody else out of power.
Yeah.
This is one of those unique elections where most people will be voting against one candidate or the other, not in favor.
Yeah, that's for sure. I have one quick question for you. You may not have an answer, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask this, and then I have one more question after that, and we'll be done. But I have to ask this. I know you weren't in the White House for this event, but I'm wondering if you have any, if you ever heard anything about it. I'm a huge Elvis Presley fan, huge. And if you know, Elvis Presley showed up to the White House in 1970 to meet with President Nixon. Now, I know you weren't there at that time.
Wrong.
But really?
Oh, yes.
Oh my God! Please, please. Okay, tell me your experience of this.
Man, I was right smack in the middle of it.
No way.
Oh yes.
Oh my God.
So,
okay, I'm shaking with excitement.
Elvis shows up at the Southwest Gate with a friend. Says, "I want to meet with the president. I have a gift I want to give him." And the guards rightfully say, "Well, tell us how to get back in touch with you. We'll get around to it." So this is maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. Okay. The gift he wants to give him is a commemorative revolver.
Yeah.
Okay. Chrome 6-shooter.
Yeah.
So there ensues a debate amongst the staff. Do we want to do this? What's in it for Nixon? Elvis is closer to the end of his career than we realize, but he's little loose ends. He tours, and then in between tours, he gorges, and then he's got to lose massive amount of weight to go back on his tour. Okay, so and he uses pills to do it. Okay, so there are two main individuals involved. The appointments secretary, a guy named Dwight Chapin, that I exchange emails with or talk to almost every day today. I do joint panels with him. And Bud Krogh, the guy, my immediate supervisor on John Ehrlichman's staff, who is in charge of the law and order issue. So these two guys and Ehrlichman and Haldeman and then they go in and recommend to Nixon. We think it's worth it. So they call Elvis to come back, say this is 11 or 11:30. I could be off on the times. And he shows up with his two friends, and we bring him over to the old EOB where Bud's office is. And my office is right across the hall because I'm Bud's senior deputy. And we shoot the breeze with Elvis and his two compatriots.
You're kidding.
For about an hour, waiting for the president's schedule to clear. But the real purpose is to chit-chat and make sure he's not high.
Yeah.
Okay, before we take him over. Now, Elvis has on that costume. You've seen the picture.
Oh, iconic.
It's the single most sought after picture in all of National Archives.
Yep.
The president and the king. Okay?
Yes.
Elvis is striding up and down the hallway, sweeping into the offices where there's a secretary and embracing the secretary. Okay? Screams, and then Elvis sweeps out with his cape. And Elvis has a rash. Okay? Because he's on these diet pills and it itches. So I take him down to see the White House physician, Chet Ward, a naval officer, to give him some salve to put on his rash. And Elvis is, when he's away from the girls, he's quiet and he's polite. He's not nuts. Yeah. And he talks about he's just bought his two friends brand new Rolls Royces, and you ought to come down to Nashville and we'll put you up. We'll have a great time. And then the word comes through. President's ready. So Bud and Elvis walk over from the EOB to the West Wing to go see the president. And we've separated him from his two sidekicks. But when he gets in, he says, I have two friends that wanted to meet you too. So Elvis looks at Bud and says, well, sure. So they send for the two other guys. And I didn't walk him over. Somebody else did. You got to have a pass, to go into the West Wing.
Right.
So at one point, Elvis is trying to tell the president how much he loves his country, and he actually hugs the president.
Yeah.
You don't hug the president. And Nixon looks over at Krogh, what have you done? And they finish off. So Elvis asks, he wants a badge, a police badge. He collects police badges.
Right.
And he wants a badge from, I'm looking to see what, mine's at home. He wants one from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs.
Yep.
And he says to the president, I can't make a big thing out of it, but in my performances, I tell my audience, guys, stay away from drugs. They're not going to help you, but I can't come out in the front. I mean, that's not going to work, but I want this badge. So Nixon says to Bud, I think we can do that. Bud brings him back. This has been fun. Elvis departs. And we think we have a home run. This is really cool. Nixon's cool. We like this stuff. This will help with the reelection. And then my secretary, who's a redhead, gives me this note, shows me this note. And she says, Elvis gave me this. And it says, I'm registered at the Hotel Washington in room 2002 under the name John Burroughs. Come see me. Okay? So, isn't that fun? Next morning, she comes in late, somewhat bedraggled, But we never let her forget it. Never let her forget it. But I confess, she departed soon thereafter. But it was quite something. Now, Bud's written a book about it, the day Elvis met Nixon or the day Nixon met Elvis. I don't think I have it easily on my bookshelf. I own, you see on my bookshelves, I own every book written by anybody who was really there during Watergate. I don't read books by people who write using those books as sources, revisionists. Yeah. But between those books, and I have, file cabinet not on camera, 16 linear feet of files from the special prosecutor's office and from other sources on Watergate. So I think I'm the foremost authority on the Watergate prosecutions, partially because everybody else has died, but partially because I haven't done much else for 20 years. So when we did this interview that I mentioned with Tucker Carlson, lots of friends, it's been viewed 6 million times. Lots of friends have said, you didn't miss a beat. You knew so much. I'm just astonished. And my reaction is, yes, but I don't do anything else. I live in the past.
Yeah, you devoted your life to it.
Well, I think that's fair.
That is extraordinary. That Wow. I'm like shaking with excitement. You got to meet the king himself and chop it up with him for an hour. That is just extraordinary. But
Well,
I have one more.
he actually came back. Uh, we gave him the badge from BNDD, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and the head of it, John Ingersoll, retired about a year later. And Elvis, for some reason, thought he worked in the EOB. So the guard calls me and says, Elvis is here to see John Ingersoll. What should we do? And I said, I'll come right down. And the car has come in past the Southwest Gate and is idling on West Executive Avenue. If you can picture it, it's not up to where the West Wing is. It's about 30 feet past the Southwest entrance. So I go down. Elvis doesn't get out of the car. He rolls down his window. I said, Jack is in another building, but I'll get this to him. He gives me a box. I'll get this to him. He says, thanks. Great to see you again. You know, this is just wonderful. And his driver makes a left turn towards 17th Street, goes under the old EOB. There's a driveway going through and exits on the other side. And I spin on my heel and I look at the guard and I say, you want to tell me how he got past that gate without a pass? And the guard smiles and says, I was with him every step of the way, Mr. Shepard. And then finally, and we have to finish. Years later, my son needs a merit badge, and it's called Citizenship in the Nation. And the way it turns out, if you go to Washington, you qualify for the merit badge. Mm-hmm. So he's going to come home from school over Christmas. We're going to go down, and it occurs to me that it's cold outside, and standing around outside on December 23rd isn't going to be much fun. So the day before, I call 3 offices of people I used to know that are still in government. And I don't talk to them. I just talk to their secretary. And I say, look, I'm bringing my kid down tomorrow. And I wonder if we could just look at the office. I'm sure your principal isn't even at work. But I just want to, we'll get out of the cold. You can say, this is where this guy sits. So they said, okay, let us get back to you. So at 9 o'clock, my son and I meet with the Chief Justice of the United States, Bill Rehnquist, who's now gone on the court. And it turns out Rehnquist was a Boy Scout. So he and my son talk about scouting. At 10 o'clock, we go over to the West Wing, and we go through the Northwest Gate to meet with Colin Powell, who is National Security Advisor. And my son, who's 14, doesn't have picture ID. And Colin's office has cleared Geoff Shepard and Richard Shepard, his son. And the guard doesn't quite know what to do because it's not Richard, it's Jonathan. And there's no ID. So he calls over his supervisor. And the supervisor says, I think it'll be all right. I remember Mr. Shepard from the time he was on the White House staff. In fact, he was here the day Elvis came. Well, my son about shit's bricks. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I didn't think my dad was cool, Yeah. And then we go in, and honest to Pete, there's my good friend Colin Powell. He talks to my kid while we're standing there talking to him. President Bush asks to see him. So Colin says, I got to cut this short. I'm going to go across the hall, and we exit like we walked into the White House every day. And then we went over and we talked to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs about foreign relations. Wow. So nothing's more fun than taking your kids down history's lane.
Yeah, that is absolutely extraordinary. Geoff, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. Thank you for doing the work that you're doing, digging deep and illuminating the truth.
I talked to Luke Nectar about you before I decided to come, and so I'm glad we both have given you time. Good luck to you, Jake.
Awesome. Thank you so much.